Traveling west on the Santa Fe Trail was hard enough all on its own. Doing so in the midst of an unexpected cold spell with a wife and infant daughter in tow could be downright miserable. Thus was the difficulty facing a trader by the name of James White in October of 1849. The wagon train had made the journey all the way from Missouri without incident, and James, brimming with a touch of impatience, decided to strike on ahead with just his family and a few others, hoping to make the final push into Santa Fe just a tad bit quicker. A hasty decision that would cost the lives of all involved. The warriors came upon them not far from present-day Maxwell, New Mexico. Jicarillas they were, Apache, demanding handouts. Initially, James just shooed them away, feeling confident that his small party could fend the beggars off if need be. And it was a small party. Other than James, his wife Anne, and daughter Virginia, you had another lady, a black servant whose name is unfortunately unknown, and just 4 other men. Not nearly enough to stop what was coming. And I'm sure you can guess what happens next. The Apache returned with reinforcements, and this time they didn't ask so nice. Later, when the soldiers came to investigate, they found James's body right alongside the other men, having already been picked at by the wolves. As for the 2 women, Anne and the servant, they weren't nowhere to be found, and neither was little Virginia. The family friend put up a $1,000 reward for their safe return, and it weren't long before some local pueblos reported seeing a female matching Anne's description in the nearby Jicarilla camp. As such, soldiers from Taos, the 1st Dragoons under a Major William Greer, immediately mobilized and headed east, picking up some talent along the way. You see, Major Greer knew good and well that he and his soldiers couldn't track no Apache, at least not effectively. Now you needed someone who was familiar with the Jicarillas, who had previous dealings with the tribe and understood their ways of thinking. And who better than Kit Carson, the most famous tracker and Indian fighter west of the mighty Mississippi. The only question is, would old Kit be up for the job? My name's Josh, and this is the Wild West Extravaganza. By the spring of 1849, Kit Carson was finally making moves to settle down. For the last several years, he'd been out west with the Pathfinder, John C. Fremont, as they attempted to conquer California. This was followed by a series of trips that saw Kit ferrying dispatches overland from the west coast all the way to Washington, D.C. It wasn't until after the war with Mexico that Carson was able to return home to his wife Josefa and once more try his hand at farming. And I say farming, but in addition to growing an assortment of crops, Carson would also raise cattle and sheep along a modest herd of horses and mules. Probably not the easiest job in the world, especially considering that Kit still had to keep his eyes peeled for hostiles. After all, his spread was located smack dab in the middle of Apache territory. A fact that would send shivers down the spines of most men, but I guess Kit was just built different. Hell, the Apaches would even swing by the ranch on occasion looking for food. And more often than not, Carson was a generous host, giving the warriors what they asked for so long as it was within reason. That said, he also wasn't afraid to show a little strength. Kit and the Apaches hadn't always seen eye to eye, especially when he and his wife first settled there on Riado Creek, and the Jicarilla figured they could just raid Carson's livestock as if he were a common settler. According to at least one visitor to the Carson homestead, quote, being thoroughly acquainted with the haunts of the Indians, he, Carson, had punished them so severely that they found it in their best policy to make peace with him. He now enjoyed their friendship and often gave them meat, and they no longer molested his stock, although they continued to steal from others. End quote. So yeah, Carson obviously knew how to handle the Apaches. He had his first run-in with them 2 decades prior when he was still a teenager, and that's not including the additional tribes that Kit interacted with during his time as a fur trapper. With that in mind, it's no surprise that the aforementioned Major Greer of the 1st Dragoons came a-calling. And by the way, Greer already had some very capable guides at his disposal, men like Tom Tobin, Anton LaRue, and Uncle Dick Wooten. Experienced frontiersmen all, and I have no doubt they'd have been as equally successful in locating Ann White. Only thing Carson had on Greer's scouts is a little something known as fame. Not to say that Tom Tobin or even Anton LaRue weren't well known. They were, especially out west. They just weren't quite at Carson's level of notoriety, and they damn sure didn't have people back east writing books about them. Now, to a certain extent, Carson's reputation is based on his real-life exploits. I mean, let's face it, there's a reason we're still talking about the guy to this day. He just flat out led a fascinating life. That said, back in 1849, a decent chunk of Kit's fame was simply due to having friends in high places, namely the explorer John C. Fremont and Fremont's daddy-in-law, U.S. Senator Thomas Benton, extremely influential men who spread the word of Kit's heroic adventures far and wide. And then there were the books. Penny dreadfuls and dime novels that depicted the just 5.5-foot tall Carson as being almost superhuman, an oak of a man who killed scores of Indians each day before breakfast just to get his appetite up. Descriptions that would cause women to swoon and even his greatest of fans to feel let down when they met the famous scout in person. Truth be told, I don't think anyone, not even the great Kit Carson, could live up to the legend that these books had created. It would almost be funny to think about if it weren't for the tragic fate of Anne White. Turns out Mrs. White had one of these books in her possession at the time of abduction. The Prince of the Gold Seekers by Charles Averill, a work of pure fiction that had Carson rescuing a damsel in distress from the natives. Sadly, Anne White wouldn't be so lucky. Kit found her, sure. Hell, everybody knew that he would. He just got to her a little too late. Kind of. Truth be told, Anne was still alive when Carson located the Jicarillas. And had Major Greer of the 1st Dragoons done what Kit had told him to do, there's a very good chance she would have remained alive. Upon spotting the village, Carson almost immediately ordered an attack, spurring on ahead and hoping to catch the Apaches by surprise. Greer, however, countermanded this charge by telling the Dragoons to stay put, leaving Kit with no other choice but to abort and return back to the column. I guess the Major figured that he could just talk with the Jicarillas and they'd turn over their captives without putting up a fight. Minutes began ticking past, and sure enough, the Apaches took notice and began to flee. One of them was even so bold as to take a shot at Major Greer, but luckily for him, the bullet lost velocity and simply knocked the wind out of him. It was then and only then that Greer ordered a charge, but like I said earlier, it was just too damn late. And when the Dragoons located Mrs. White's ravaged body, it was still warm, her emaciated face, according to Carson, bearing the quote-unquote sorrows of agony. Apparently, as the Apaches were making their getaway, one of the warriors loosed an arrow into Anne's chest, and that was all she wrote. In camp, we found a book, Carson later recalled, the first of the kind I had ever seen, in which I was made a great hero, slaying Indians by the 100. And I have often thought that as Mrs. White would read the same, and knowing that I lived near, she would pray for my appearance and that she would be saved. I did come, but had not the power to convince those who were in command over me to pursue my plan for her rescue. End quote. Needless to say, this loss would haunt Carson for years to come. To quote biographer Hampton Sides, the real Kit Carson had met the fictional, and was deeply upset at his inability to save Mrs. White, for he had failed to live up to the growing myth around himself. But I guess life goes on, right? In the years following this failed rescue, Kit would mostly stay at home, save for an occasional trip to indulge his wanderlust, like in 1850 when he trailed a herd of horses all the way from New Mexico to Fort Laramie, or the following year when he helped to guide a trading expedition. Hal Carson would even venture back to California in 1853 with over 6,000 head of sheep for the hungry prospectors. For the most part, though, these adventures were short-lived, and Carson would return home to Taos just as quick as he could. The days of him being gone for years at a time appeared to be over, at least for the time being, especially once he was appointed to oversee the Utah Indian Agency. Now this is kind of confusing, so please just bear with me for a moment. Turns out there were 3 separate Utah or Ute agencies. One of them was in the territory of Utah, another at Fort Bridger, and the third, which Carson was in charge of, headquartered out of his own personal home there in Taos. That being the case, in addition to keeping peace among the Ute, Kit would also have to watch over the Pueblos and even the Jicarilla Apaches. And considering that Carson wasn't much of a desk job kind of guy, this meant that he'd often take to the field, not only as an agent, but also freelancing on the side as a scout for the Army, especially during what's now known as the Jicarilla War, when the Apaches and the Utes teamed up to raid travelers along the Santa Fe Trail. In May of 1854, Carson was hired on as a guide for then Major James Henry Carleton to help retrieve horses stolen by the Jicarilla. And although the trail was cold, it didn't take Kit all that long to pick it up. He even predicted when they'd encounter the guilty Apaches, right down to the exact hour, later on that day at 2 p.m. Major Carleton wasn't buying it, though, and he ended up telling Kit that if they really did intercept the Apaches at 2 p.m., then he, Carleton, would buy Carson the fanciest beaver hat that money could buy in New York City. And as it turns out, Carson was wrong. They did not find the Jicarilla at 2 p.m., but rather at 2:07 p.m. Still, though, Carlton was sufficiently impressed, and several months later, Kit received said beaver hat in the mail, complete with an inscription on the inner band that read, "At 2 o'clock, Kit Carson from Major Carlton." And by the way, this was not the first time that these two had worked together. A few years prior, it was Carlton who helped to pull Kit's bacon out of the fire. Back in 1851, Carson traveled to Missouri to fetch his daughter Adeline. Theirs was a small group consisting of just around a dozen or so, including Kit's young niece, Susan. On the return trip home in what's now western Kansas, they were paid a visit by some pretty ticked-off Southern Cheyenne. Apparently, one of them had recently been flogged by the military after some minor infraction, and as I'm sure you can imagine, they were on the hunt for a little retribution. To once again quote Hampton's sides, "Any whites would do, preferably the first ones they saw, and Carson's party fit the bill. It didn't matter that Carson was ignorant of the original offense. This was a tribal ethic Carson knew all too well, and had practiced himself as a trapper and as a guide with Fremont. Now Carson found himself on the opposite side of the same code by which he had lived for years. At first, Kit invited the warriors into camp for a smoke, hoping to stop things from getting too far out of hand. Guess the Cheyenne weren't having it, though, and they began talking openly amongst themselves in their own tongue about murdering Carson as soon as he turned his back. To which Kit responded, himself in the Cheyenne dialect, quote, "I do not know the cause of your wishing my scalp. I've done you no injury and welcomed you as friends, but now you must leave." And leave they did, returning the following day with even more warriors. Once again, Carson confronted him, saying that he had sent a rider on ahead, which he had done the previous night, and that he'd return with soldiers, so if anything happened to he or his friends, the army would avenge him. Next thing you know, here comes Major Carlton with a detachment of dragoons, riding hell for leather to the rescue. No idea what would have happened had they not shown up, but Kit Carson was nothing if not loyal, and from that day forward, he felt like he owed his life, and the life of his daughter, to Major Carlton. As it turns out, the two would spend a good deal of time working together around a decade later. And Carson, although oftentimes disagreeing with Carlton's tactics, did indeed remain loyal, even when he didn't want to. Fun fact, it was Carlton who, in 1859, would help to bury the remains of those killed in the Mountain Meadows Massacre, an event that I most definitely plan on covering here on the Wild West Extravaganza in the near future. Now, all total, Kit would spend around 6 years as an Indian agent. And according to Marshall D. Moody in his essay, Kit Carson, Agent to the Indians, quote, "In the performance of his duties as agent, Carson used great common sense and tact. Carson may not have been overly fond of the job, but there is little doubt that his heart was in it and remained so until more important duties called. If one looks objectively at Carson as Indian agent, the conclusion must be reached that he was a man eminently well qualified, who served most of 3 terms efficiently, with humanity and consideration. That while he made errors, he did the best he could to further the interest of the government which he represented, and at the same time to secure the maximum amount of care and justice for the Indians of his agency." End of quote. So yeah, once again, we start to see somewhat of a softening in Kit's approach to the Native Americans. There would be no withheld rations or starvation or otherwise shady practices on Carson's watch. By all accounts, he dealt squarely with the indigenous, and in turn, they respected him. Even General Sherman would comment on it, saying that the Indians, quote, "think Kit twice as big a man as me. Why, his integrity is simply perfect. They know it, and they would believe him and trust him any day before me." Now, like I said earlier, when Carson was serving as agent, he was headquartered out of his own home in Taos, which meant at long last he finally got a chance to get to know his growing family. Although records are sparse, it looks like by 1860, his wife Josefa had given birth to at least 4 children, and before it was all said and done, Kit would have somewhere between 8 or 9 kids of his own. And that's not including helping to raise some of the offspring of his dearly departed friend Charles Bent. An acquaintance would describe Kit as an adoring father who would, quote, "lie down on an Indian blanket with his pockets full of candy and lumps of sugar. His children would then jump on top of him and take the candy from his pockets." End quote. And believe it or not, Carson would also become a Freemason during this period. Cue the conspiracy theories. According to biographer Hampton Sides, who I just cannot stop quoting, apparently, Kit had finally achieved the sense of stability that he had longed for during the 1840s. He had become a pillar of the community, a member of the local gentry, a good Catholic, a provider, a diplomat to the Indians, and a devoted father and husband. It wasn't all sunshine and rainbows, though. After all, by the year 1860, Carson was getting a little long in the tooth, a condition made even worse after an accident that damn near cost him his life. Story goes that Kit was hunting elk up in the San Juans when his horse took a fall off the side of a cliff. Both man and beast went a-tumbling, and the pony ended up rolling over on Carson several times. Although he would survive this ordeal, Kit was physically just never the same again. He had a pain in his chest that never seemed to go away, and he even took to saying that his days in the saddle were over, and from that moment forward he vowed to travel only via carriage. Now obviously this would not be the case. Despite his advanced years, Carson still had quite a few more adventures left in him, and you better believe he wasn't planning on setting out the Civil War looming on the horizon. The only question was, which side would Kit fight on, the Union or the Confederacy? Remember, Carson was reared in Missouri, and when it came to the issues of slavery and succession, Missouri was a divided state. Many of Kit's relatives sympathized with the Southern cause, and his own brother would fight and ultimately die for the rebels. As far as Carson was concerned, he pretty much kept his opinions to himself, something I think we could all benefit from doing. But that also means we don't really know whether or not he was an abolitionist. Hell, there's even speculation that Carson himself owned slaves while residing in New Mexico. Indeed, he and his wife did have 3 Navajo servants, former captives that Kit had purchased from other tribes. It's thought by some that they were adopted and considered full-fledged members of the Carson family, but how true that is, I can't say. The sad fact of the matter is that slavery had a very long history there in New Mexico. The Spanish had spent centuries enslaving the indigenous, and the natives were doing the same to each other long before the Europeans ever showed up. Not to mention the practice of peonage that continued even after New Mexico became a territory of the United States. Us humans, man, we just love oppressing one another. So yeah, that said, and regardless of Carson's own personal convictions about slavery, he would choose to enlist with the Union Army, either out of a sense of patriotism or simply an allegiance to his old boss, John C. Fremont, or maybe even both. At first, Kit was thinking that he'd do like he had always done and just serve as a guide, but as it turns out, the military had other plans. Rather than utilize the old frontiersman as a scout, they instead gave him the rank of lieutenant colonel. And much to Kit's surprise, and possibly even his dismay, when the regiment's commander resigned in September of 1861, it was Carson who was placed in charge of the entire damn outfit. The 1st New Mexico Volunteer Infantry, comprised of around 1,000 mostly Hispanic men. By October, Kit was promoted to a full-bird colonel, and by the following February, he and his troops were facing off with Johnny Reb at the Battle of Valverde, the first major engagement of the Civil War there in New Mexico. On one side, you had about 3,000 Confederates under the command of Brigadier General Henry Sibley, or the walking whiskey keg as he was sometimes referred to due to his fondness for spirits. And on the other side, there at Fort Craig, you had a Colonel Edward Canby with just shy of 4,000 troops, including Carson's volunteer infantry. Interestingly enough, Fort Craig was just some 40-odd miles away from where Carson had first met up with General Kearny back in 1846. And as it turns out, General Sibley had pretty much the same plan as Kearny, to conquer New Mexico and then push further west and take control of California. Only thing was, he and his men were poorly provisioned and desperately in need of the supplies there at Fort Craig. So while Canby was hoping to lure the rebels into an ill-advised attack on the fort, at the same time Sibley was trying to draw them out into the open ground where he felt like his horse soldiers would have the upper hand. Finally, on February 21st, Canby ordered the bulk of his men out of the fort, Carson included, mostly with the goal of preventing the Confederates from crossing to the east side of the Rio Grande. As for Carson and his volunteers, they were held in reserve at first, but were soon helping to repulse an attack on the right flank from the 4th Texas. And although Carson was successful, another bunch of rebels were able to break through to the center, at which point Canby called for a retreat as they hightailed it back to the safety of the fort. Once again, per Hampton sides, quote, Kit Carson and his volunteers were dumbfounded by Canby's order. From their point of view, on the Union far right, the battle was faring well. In fact, they felt they were on the verge of victory. Captain Raphael Chacon, fighting with Carson, wrote that he could not understand the signals to retreat. We had penetrated the enemy zone and considered that our charge had won the battle. As far as everyone was concerned, Carson and his men accounted well for themselves during the fight. but it still went down as a rebel victory, despite Sibley failing to capture Fort Craig. He and his Texans would instead press north and take Albuquerque before being defeated at the Battle of Glorieta Pass later on that March. As for Kit, he remained behind at Fort Craig. I guess Canby really didn't have all that much faith in his regiment. And besides, as it turns out, the military, in their infinite wisdom, had other plans for old Kit Carson. Back in 1861, Colonel Canby had ordered the abandonment of Fort Stanton, which at that time was home to the Mescalero Apache. And these Apaches were mostly reliant on the rations promised to them by the Army. And once those soldiers left and said rations dried up, the Apaches simply went back to their old ways, which included raiding the ranches and settlements there in south-central New Mexico. That being the case, Carson was charged with leading 5 companies to occupy and rebuild Fort Stanton, in addition to pacifying the Mescaleros. The official orders, given by his old friend, now General James Carleton, read in part as follows. All Indian men of the tribe, Mescalero Apache, are to be killed whenever and wherever you find them. The women and children will not be harmed, but you will take them prisoner and feed them at Fort Stanton. Apparently, General Carleton thought that such a drastic measure, killing all the men, would, quote, be the most humane course that could be pursued towards these Indians. Now, the plan was to settle whoever Carson didn't kill on a brand new reservation known as the Bosque Redondo, a 1,600 square mile tract of good-for-nothing land that would also be the future site of Fort Sumner. Matter of fact, Fort Sumner was originally established to oversee the Bosque Redondo. Fort would be abandoned in 1869, however, and then purchased by one of Kit's old pals, Lucian Maxwell, who'd go on to rebuild the officers' quarters into a spacious 20-room home. It was in that same house years later where a young outlaw known as Billy the Kid would meet his demise at the hands of Pat Garrett. But that's a whole nother story that takes place almost 2 decades after our current timeline. Check out the series I did on the Kid if you'd like to learn all the juicy details. Link down below. Alright, let's get back to Kit Carson. Now, before Carson would arrive at Fort Stanton, Captain James Graydon engaged a group of around 30 mescaleros at Galena Springs. Graydon lured them in with promises of food and provisions, and then, once they let their guard down, he and his men opened fire, killing 11, including 2 chiefs, and wounding another 20. This was followed by a similar attack that convinced the remaining mescaleros that maybe surrendering to Carson wouldn't be all that bad of an idea. And to his credit, Carson did completely ignore Carleton's orders to shoot all of the men. Instead, he simply accepted their surrender with dignity. The entire campaign would only last about a month, and by March of 1863, the bulk of the mescaleros, around 400 or 500, were settled on the Bosque Redondo. Now you know how it goes, right? The better you are at your job, the more responsibility your boss will pile onto your back. Same thing occurred with Kit Carson. No sooner had he delivered the mescaleros to the reservation when General Carleton called on him to do the exact same with the Navajo. Only thing is, Carson just wasn't feeling it. First of all, he had joined the army to help defeat the Confederates, not fight the daggum Native Americans. And secondly, I know we touched on this earlier, but the dude was just getting old. Kit turned 54 in 1863, and the injuries he sustained during that horse accident back in 1860 were still troubling him. Then there's the simple fact that going after the Navajo would not be the cakewalk that General Carleton seemed to think it would be. There were a hell of a lot more Navajo than there were Mescalero Apaches, and they damn sure weren't going to give up without a struggle. At this point, all Kit wanted to do was just go home, snuggle up with that pretty little wife of his, and play with the children. So he did what I think a lot of us would do and sent off a letter of resignation consisting of just 12 words. Take this job and shove it. I ain't scouting here no more. No. Carson did send a letter of resignation, one that he, of course, had to have someone else write on his behalf, but it was much more diplomatic than the lyrics of a damn Johnny Paycheck song. In the letter, Kit laid out the case that he had already proven his devotion to the government by fighting those Texians at Valverde. Furthermore, should the Texans return, it would be his pride and pleasure to suit up and fight them again. But at the same time, he felt that, quote, duty as well as happiness directs me to home and family, and trust that the general will accept my resignation. I am sorry that I have obliged to dissolve our official connection, but it shall ever be my proudest thought that I had the honor and happiness of serving under Brigadier General Carleton. End quote. Now, I do feel like it's important to mention that Carson was not resigning out of some sense of morality. He himself had no issues whatsoever with placing the natives on a reservation. Matter of fact, he was pretty much of the mind that by doing so, it would work out in their favor, or in other words, it would be for their own good. Which, let's be honest, is something that you see a lot of in history. People just constantly trampling on the rights of others and claiming it's for their own good. Be that as it may, Carson was very vocal in his belief that most of the Indian troubles were caused, quote, by aggressions on the part of the whites. Kit rightfully deduced that most of the raids on the settlements were done out of desperation, from a, quote, absolute necessity when in a starving condition. Game is becoming scarce, most of it having been killed by the settlers and a good deal of it driven from the country. They, the indigenous, are unable to support themselves by the chase and the hunt. End of quote. Also, Kit realized full well that there weren't no stopping the never-ending tide of white migration. Not that he was against America's westward expansion, mind you. He himself helped open up the floodgates. But at the same time, Carson knew that, like it or not, there weren't no reversing the tides of civilization. The only hope for the natives, as far as he was concerned, was for them to accept change. Either adapt to the ways of the white man or face extinction. That being the case, his preferred method was to remove the indigenous to somewhere far away from the white or Hispanic settlements. But at the same time, teach them how to farm and learn to live like quote-unquote civilized people. And by the way, Carson's idea of keeping them separated from the settlements, once again, as cringy as this sounds, was, in his way of thinking, for their own good, under the assumption that the more they mingled with the whites, the more they would destroy their own culture and the more bad habits they would pick up, like, the use of alcohol. Kit was also in favor of making the reservations on, or as near as possible, to the tribe's own ancestral land. The Navajo, for instance, who General Carleton wanted him to go after, had very strong taboos about leaving the confines of what they considered their sacred mountains. Carson understood this. He also understood that uprooting them from their own territory and sending them hundreds of miles away to a place like the Bosque Redondo would likely demoralize them so thoroughly that it would destroy any chance of the reservation becoming a success. Now, I do want to make it clear that none of this stemmed from Kit's love of the Navajo people. Remember, Carson had been living with the Hispanics there in New Mexico for quite a long time, and as far as most of them were concerned, the Navajo were public enemy number one. A lot of families had lost loved ones, or even just their livelihood, due to the Navajo. Even the Ute, who Carson considered allies, despised the Navajo. But still, even as hated as the Navajo were, Kit just flat out did not want this job. Let someone else handle it. All he wanted to do was return home and spend his twilight years sitting on the porch telling lies to his grandkids. In the end, though, I guess it doesn't really matter what Kit Carson wanted. According to the Rolling Stones, you can't always get what you want, right? And Carson would have to hold off on that rocking chair for the time being. Not only did General Carleton refuse his resignation, but he also went to work on the former mountain man's sense of duty, pretty much saying that the people of New Mexico needed him, that nobody else could get the job done, and not only that, but removing the Navajo to the reservation would prove to be the greatest achievement of his life. And yeah, I guess it worked. Remember what I said earlier about Carson being loyal. He still felt like he owed General Carleton, so, against his own judgment, he relented. Carson would lead a campaign against the Navajo, but rather than it being his greatest achievement, it would turn out to be his greatest controversy. And for the Navajo, it would be absolutely devastating. And I think that's as good a place as any to wrap things up for today.